Allen & Company wishes OOIDA and all members a safe, healthy, and joyous holiday season.
OOIDA, representing America's truckers since 1973, presents Landline Now with your host, Mark Reddick.
In January, 5 states are set to implement new emission standards for trucks. And despite widespread pushback, the plans are moving forward. Tyson Fisher of Landline Magazine joins Scott Thompson to explain. A task force assembled by FMCSA to examine lease-purchase agreements is nearing the end of its mission, and its final report is sure to generate a lot of headlines in trucking. I'll talk with OOIDA Director of Federal Affairs, Jay Grimes. And finally, the move by EPA and CARB to move trucking toward electric vehicles has generated a lot of concern. Several states are following California's lead, including Oregon, where efforts are underway to delay or stop the regulation. I'll talk with Oregon State Representative Shelley Bosshart Davis. And now, here's Scott Thompson.
Thanks, Mark. In less than a month, a number of states are set to begin implementation of advanced clean trucks regulations. As we get closer to that start date, the states putting the new rules into effect are seeing increased pushback from trucking industry stakeholders. For details on all the latest and where we may be heading, we are joined by Tyson Fisher, Associate Editor of Landline Magazine. Tyson, good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
So this thing, I think, has slipped a bit under the radar with everything else that's been going on of late. So let's get the basics out of the way here for those who may not be completely familiar with what we're talking about here. Advanced clean trucks. Just what are these states looking to do?
Yeah, so advanced clean trucks requires manufacturers to sell increasing percentages of zero direct emission trucks through model year 2035. So we'll use Volvo, for example, here. So for model year 2025, so next year, Volvo will be required so zero emission trucks must account for 7% of all of Volvo's Class 7 and 8 tractor sales in California and 5 other states. Those 5 other states include New York, Oregon, Washington State, Massachusetts, and New Jersey. So that percentage will increase. So by model year 2035, Class 7 and 8 tractor sales, zero emission trucks must account for 40% of those sales. And this kind of just ramps up like this. Now, this applies to manufacturers, right? So there is no mandate on dealers or trucking companies or fleets. However, in order to hit that 7% sales target, manufacturers are requiring dealers to sell a certain amount of electric trucks. So in New York, it's like a 1-to-13 ratio. So if you want to buy 13 diesel trucks, you got to sell 1 electric truck for me first.
Right. Okay. And so that's where we stand right now. And again, January is when this rule is set to go into effect. In the lead up to it, especially in the past few weeks, we have seen these concerns bubble up across these states where, again, this is set to go into effect. Can you talk a little bit about the groundswell of opposition that we have seen in recent weeks? We've seen state attorneys general, trucking groups, you name it. Anybody associated with this who has concerns has spoken up. What exactly are their concerns and what are they saying?
So it's you need to understand that this comes from California. So everyone's adopting California's rule, which they implemented it this year. So California would tell you it's going well. It's debatable, but for the sake of argument, let's just say that it is. Mm-hmm. Everyone else is saying that they are not California. So, like, first and foremost, California is not just the largest state economy. It's the 5th largest economy in the world. And so they have the money and the resources. So, for example, California has invested heavily in infrastructure, charging infrastructure specifically, money that the other states don't have. In New York, the charging infrastructure is virtually non-existent. California has also invested heavily on incentive programs that gives money to owner-operators and fleets for the upfront cost. That's money that other states don't have. And so, it works well for California because of the money and the resources that they have that the other states don't have. And that's kind of the argument, which is, why are we adopting rules that make sense in California that can't apply here in the exact same way? That being said, Class 7 and 8 electric trucks in California account for less than 2% of truck sales. That's in California, where demand for electric truck is probably the highest than anywhere else in the country, yet they can't hit that 7% sales target. And so I mean, and the reason why is because they're too expensive. The mileage's range is too small. The infrastructure is insufficient. They're heavier, so load capacity is reduced. It's just we're just not quite there yet, and that's what everyone is saying. So what some state lawmakers and what the stakeholders are saying, they're not asking to completely get rid of advanced clean trucks. They're saying right now for model year 2025, the technology isn't there yet. The infrastructure isn't there yet. Let's give it 2 years. Let's hold off on this until, let's say, model year 2027, and then we'll kind of reevaluate to see where we are at to then. But right now, clearly, we're just not there.
Yeah, that's the ask. That obviously is just a request, but we have seen legal challenges, we have seen pushback, we've seen letters, we've seen any number of things out there, asking for these states to push it back. We are, again, just a few weeks away from this going into effect. What does that opposition look like in terms of getting to a place where those people who are worried about it are going to be satisfied?
Yeah, there are efforts to roll this back in all 5 of those states that we mentioned, and so. Like in New York, for example, trucking stakeholders with the backing of some state lawmakers are trying to delay it to 2027. So Senate Bill 9910 in the state would prohibit the enforcement of the rule until the availability of charging infrastructure and the cost and availability of zero-emission trucks make the sale of such vehicles much more practical. So that's kind of where it's going on in New York. Washington State, so the Washington Truck Association sent a letter to the governor of state lawmakers urging them to reconsider advanced clean trucks for the moment. In Oregon, Representative Shelley Beauchart Davis sent a letter to the state, again, asking them to delay 2027. New Jersey, there are bills to delay until 2027. And in Massachusetts, dozens of lawmakers are requesting a 2-year delay. So there are efforts from lawmakers and stakeholders alike to delay this by 2 years. It's worth noting, though, in New York and Massachusetts, the state is exempting certain vehicles for local and state government agencies because of availability issues. So when the public sector, right.
Yeah.
So when the public sector is saying, hey, we can't do this right now, the government's like, okay. But when the private sector is asking for the exact same concessions, they're like, well, we can't do that. So, well, why not? And so they're just asking for that same discretion for the private sector.
Is there any hope that this is going to happen? I mean, the delay, time's running out. Yeah.
I'll tell you that.
Okay.
So I know right now there's a big push to get this, to delay it because, again, we're running out of time. So that's kind of where we were at, kind of like that 11th hour, where the clock is ticking. And so I know that some lawmakers are really making the case. And so we'll see whether or not, the governors of those states or other state lawmakers will follow suit.
And if you live and work in any of those states that you mentioned there, it may not hurt to reach out to your state lawmakers and express your concerns and, update them on what's going on, because a lot of them may not even be aware that this is happening.
Yeah, absolutely.
Tyson, you'll keep us updated. We appreciate it, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks for having me.
That was Tyson Fisher of Landline Magazine. Mark, back to you.
Thanks, Scott. OOIDA is teaming up with Wreaths Across America to help honor U.S. military veterans. OOIDA will offer the chance to sponsor a wreath for $17. For every wreath sponsored, $5 will go toward the association's Truckers for Troops campaign. Wreaths will be placed on December 14th. Starting Saturday, Marty Ellis and OOIDA's tour truck, The Spirit of the American Trucker, will be at the Quick Star in Brooklyn, Iowa. That's located at exit 201 on Interstate 80. Stop in, say hi to Marty, and join OOIDA for a $10 discount. Next, I'll discuss the report by a lease-purchase task force with OOIDA Director of Federal Affairs, Jay Grimes. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
Penske owns and operates some of the best-maintained vehicles on the planet. Our used trucks come with a 5-year maintenance report and pre-sale inspection. So if you're in the market for a top-quality pre-owned truck, look no further. Search our inventory today at PenskeUsedTrucks.com.
Capital Reman, the leader in remanufactured diesel engines and components, has partnered with OOIDA to offer exclusive member benefits. Visit CapitalReman.com today to support America's transportation industry and take advantage of your benefits.
It's tested and proven. Burn 2.1% less fuel when you balance all wheel ends with Centromatic. Call 800-523-8473 to get the OOIDA discount.
A task force assembled by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to examine lease purchase agreements is nearing the end of its mission, and its final report is sure to generate a lot of headlines in the trucking industry. Welcome back to Landline Now. This is Regulatory Roundup, and I'm Mark Reddig. I'm joined as always by OOIDA Director of Federal Affairs, Jay Grimes. Jay, how are you doing?
Doing well, Mark. Good to be back.
Well, good to have you with us, and this has certainly been something that has a lot of people's attention, and it's been kind of fascinating to follow. But before we get into the latest news, I'm wondering if you could just remind people maybe that aren't up to date on this, kind of give us an overview of what the task force's mission was.
Yeah, so the Truck Leasing Task Force was established by Congress in the 2021 Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, bipartisan infrastructure law, to examine the terms, conditions, and equitability of common truck leasing arrangements, particularly as they impact owner-operators and trucking businesses subject to such agreements. And TLTF, the Truck Leasing Task Force, was comprised of members who are representing different sectors of the industry, labor organizations, motor carriers, consumer protection groups, owner-operators, the legal space, educators, and other related businesses. And the committee began meeting in the summer of last year, has held a number of meetings, had a public listening session down at Matt's, and kind of as you mentioned, they are winding down the committee's work and are started the process of finalizing the Truck Leasing Task Force report and recommendations. They held their final public meeting earlier this week on Tuesday to take care of some concluding agenda items and tasks. And, I think based on kind of the consensus agreement that we've seen throughout this committee process, particularly as it relates to predatory lease purchase agreements, and considering what was discussed at the committee meeting earlier this week, very optimistic that they're going to be providing Department of Transportation, FMCSA, as well as the Department of Labor and Congress with some meaningful policies moving forward.
One of the things that I think has fed into that, and you mentioned the listening session at the Mid-America Trucking Show in Louisville earlier this year, and that is the input from truck drivers who have been involved in these lease purchase agreements, and there's been some fairly dramatic testimony to this task force.
Yeah, no doubt. So that was really the main focus of the listening session back in the spring was, and I think that was. That was an opportunity for the Truck Leasing Task Force members to gather together in Louisville, and I think for pretty much the majority of one of the days at the truck show last year, heard from various drivers who have been unfortunately negatively impacted by these misleading and deceptive predatory lease purchase agreements, where these carriers and finance entities who are sometimes one and the same really, talk into these, drivers who are interested in entering the trucking industry, have a dream to own their own truck and get hooked on the sales job of being able to lease their own truck. And in a few years, it'll be theirs and under their control, and they'll be able to operate their own business. The problem is the way that these contracts and these work arrangements are structured, it really prevents that individual from ever meeting the terms of the leasing agreement. Their work is controlled by the carrier, which really prevents them from earning fair compensation, and really just most of these cases puts these individuals into kind of a cycle of debt. They never meet the end goal of getting the deed to the truck and are driven away from the industry in a lot worse shape than they entered. And we know these entities are kind of operating against the intent and nature of the law. And I think that's why this committee was formed, is to provide some substantive recommendations and some pathways moving forward that will, at a minimum, provide some oversight on these lease purchase agreements. And I think, as we heard from the task force this week, ideally would outright prohibit anyone from offering these agreements, and would provide some protections for individuals who might want to enter them.
You mentioned several times this meeting earlier this week, their last meeting, I think. And I'm wondering if we can talk about a couple of highlights here, one of which was that OOIDA made a presentation to the task force. And I'm wondering if you could just let us know who made that presentation and what are some of the main points that were made there.
Right. So OIDA President Todd Spencer addressed the task force, and one of the requirements that the task force had to meet from Congress was getting a discussion on the history of motor carriers starting from single owner operators. And FMCSA, along with the task force, I think had OIDA in mind and reached out to us to deliver this presentation. And Mr. Spencer, I think, provided some general trucking history background, how OIDA was formed back in 1973, but really got into, what the intent of the truth in leasing regulations was when OIDA first got that huge major victory back in 1979. And unfortunately, the intent of those rules to kind of provide a fair and transparent leasing structure is hardly ever followed, particularly when it comes to these predatory lease purchase arrangements. So Todd was able to kind of make the case there that this isn't something that's popped up just within the last few years. This has been a pervasive industry problem, and it really takes advantage of some long-standing problems that we continue to see throughout the industry, whether that's misclassification, where a lot of these times these workers are labeled as independent contractors as an economic advantage to the carrier, but aren't really treated or allowed to operate with any independence whatsoever. Certainly lack of driver compensation, where these drivers get paid very little. Their hours are restricted. Their loads are restricted to where they can't make ends meet. A lot of times, given the provisions within the leasing arrangement, they're actually in a negative contract, and with the deductions that the carrier takes away from the pay, the individual actually has to owe money back to the carrier in some situations, setting up that cycle of debt. So I think he really made the historical case as well as how some of the trucking industry overall, that really cracking down on these predatory lease purchase agreements can have a positive effect throughout the industry in other areas as well.
Another group that presented to the task force is the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I remember when they started that agency, I think a lot of people had the impression this is just to make sure that credit cards don't rip people off. But they've gotten involved in a lot more, including this process. And they also brought a report to the board. What were some of the highlights from that?
Yeah, so the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has kind of been an advisory agency to FMCSA throughout the truck leasing task force establishment. And they've been looking at a lot of the information that drivers have submitted to the task force and the different contracts. And they have submitted a final report that really, I think, expresses a lot of the frustration that the task force I think has voiced throughout their meetings, and it comes up with quite a few I think unfortunately not too surprising findings, but nonetheless still eye-opening, including potentially confusing earnings and expenses projections, absence of comprehensible financial disclosures, broad default provisions, the faulty use of escrow accounts and personal guarantees in these contracts, and the ease of inducing drivers to relinquish their truck when they can no longer keep up with the finances. So I think the report from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau really, I think, provides a lot of support to the consensus agreements that have been discussed, and I think will be finalized in the Truck Leasing Task Force final report.
Well, let's talk about that final report. And you said earlier that it does appear that they may outright prohibit these lease purchase agreements. Is that the only impression we have coming out of this meeting in terms of what will be in the final report, or did they kind of give some more information or hints in terms of what we can expect to see in there?
Yeah, I think we got a pretty good understanding of what the final report is going to look like. There was some debate and discussion on the draft final report, but their main recommendation, and they've got I think 5 major recommendations as well as kind of a few secondary recommendations that they're preparing to submit. And that first recommendation is a statutory prohibition that Congress should ban lease purchase agreements as irredeemable tools of fraud and driver oppression that threaten a safe national transportation system and diminish the number of drivers attracted to and who stay in the trucking industry. So that is their primary recommendation. They also talk about if Congress does not go that far, what other methods can be done to crack down on these agreements and provide necessary oversight. That includes congressional oversight, including funding and congressional hearings. They also make, I think, 13 different recommendations to the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration on oversight, a couple recommendations to the Department of Labor on enforcement, and then another section on mandatory disclosures, conditions, and prohibitions for providing lease purchase programs, certain language that would have to be in these contracts and agreements. So I think it's really a wide-ranging and an aggressive report that we're going to see kind of work its way through DOT and Department of Labor here over the next few weeks.
And I got to say, listening to that, Jay, especially some of the terminology that you were quoting from earlier, calling something a tool of financial oppression, I don't think I've ever heard an advisory panel to FMCSA ever use language that strong.
Yeah, echo that thought, but I think it really does accurately describe the experiences that individuals who have been victimized by these predatory schemes, I think, have made it clear to the task force, the data found from the CFPB as well. So I think aggressive but accurate tone that the task force is taking in their report.
This is essentially an advisory board, as we've said, and so the action is going to have to take place elsewhere. You mentioned, of course, that Congress may take some actions, or they're recommending that they do, but you also mentioned these 13 different recommendations to FMCSA. What are some of those in the time we have left here?
Yeah, number one, creating educational materials for use when entry-level drivers have to go through the required training programs now that talk about lease purchase programs. That's really kind of a big theme we've heard, that drivers have no idea what they're getting into when they enter these contracts. That would be helpful. FMCSA should mandate that motor carriers and their affiliates offering lease purchase programs keep accurate records of the experience of individuals who enter into the agreements, and the list goes on and on. So I really would, I think, give some guidance to FMCSA on how they can provide some much-needed oversight in this area, again, if Congress doesn't outright prohibit them moving forward.
Okay. Well, Jay, we could talk a long time about this. It's fascinating, but in the meanwhile, thank you very much for the update.
All right, Mark. We'll see you next time.
I've been talking with OOIDA Director of Federal Affairs, Jay Grimes. And folks, we will have links to more information at landline.media. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Running on ultra-low sulfur diesel? Stay protected this winter with Howe's Diesel Treat and Diesel Lifeline. Steer clear of gel and ice with North America's #1 trusted brand. Find Howe's products nationwide at select retailers, auto parts stores, truck stops, and on Amazon.com.
When it's time to overhaul your truck engine, help protect it by insisting on a genuine Vibertech TVD crankshaft damper. Heavy duty, absolute premium quality, and they're made right here in the USA. Find a dealer at vibertechtvd.com.
Truckdown.com. Whenever you have a breakdown, you need Truckdown.com. 24/7 access to 40,000 verified heavy-duty repair vendors nationwide.
Truck revived. Deliveries thrive.
Truckdown.com.
The move by both the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency and the California Air Resources Board to move the trucking industry toward the use of electric vehicles has generated a lot of anger and concern in trucking. With the change in administrations on January 20th, it's possible the EPA effort could be stalled out, but the California effort is still full steam ahead, and several other states are following their lead, including Oregon. You're listening to Landline Now, and I'm your host, Mark Reddick. Welcome back to the program. It's been known for many years that each state has a choice in emission regulations. They can follow EPA rules, or they can follow what CARB is doing. In part, that was something written into law at the time the EPA was created, since CARB predated its federal cousin. And that's why California's aggressive push towards zero direct emission vehicles is an issue with their neighbor to the north. Oregon, or more specifically the state's Environmental Quality Commission, adopted the rule back in November of 2021, and now that rule is scheduled to take effect in the state on January 1st of 2025, a scant few weeks away. Efforts have been made almost since the start to derail that action, or at least to delay implementation of the rule, and those efforts are still underway. One of the lawmakers who has made it her mission to oppose the Advanced Clean Trucks rule in Oregon is State Representative Shelley Bosshart Davis, who represents communities such as Albany, Millersburg, and Tangent, all south of the state capital of Salem. I spoke with Representative Bosshart Davis about the regulation, her efforts, and the potential effect on the trucking industry. This involves the Oregon Environmental Quality Commission's Advanced Clean Truck Rules. And before we get into what's happening most recently on this, I'm wondering if you can kind of review what those rules are.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Mark. And really, the clean truck rules are part of the greater CARB rules that are coming out of California. I'm sure people are familiar with that. And those rules were actually adopted in 2020 or last year, so early 2024. And so California is the first state to implement them. And there were three parts to this CARB Act. There's Clean Fleet, there's NOx, which is also called Omnibus, because we don't want to, not be confusing or anything. And then there's Clean Truck, which is really what we're talking about today. And the Clean Truck rules that are going into effect in Oregon, which is my state, is also going into effect January 1st, 2025, not just in Oregon, but in Washington, New Jersey, New York, and Massachusetts. And those are the Clean Truck rules. Which state that between class 2B and 8, so when we think truck, a lot of us think your class 7 or 8 tractor truck, which is included in this, but it starts at class 2B, which is going to be your 3/4 ton or 1 ton pickup, that between 7 and 11% of sales in 2025 have to be EV, electric. So across the nation, most people are hearing that and saying, that won't work, which really leads us to kind of what people are freaking out about. If I don't have a better word about that, it really caught people off guard because that is the basis of it, that a certain percentage of sales in these states starting year 2025 have to be EV. And we know that that's either impossible or very, very highly unattainable.
I want to clear up something that may be confusing some folks. You, of course, are in Oregon.
Yes.
And you mentioned that these are rules created by CARB, the California Air Resources Board, and folks are very accustomed to each state making their own rules. Why is Oregon and why are these other states just adopting what CARB is doing?
Well, that's a whole long discussion, right? Why are they doing that? And if you notice, these are all Democrat-led states. And so years ago, EPA allowed for you to either follow EPA or follow CARB, which is California. And they did it, and it kind of goes against the exact reason why they did it. They did it so that there's not a patchwork of rules and every state's adopting different rules across the country, which trucks that are driving across the country would have to follow all these different rules. But it still leads us with this semi-patchwork. So you can either follow EPA or you can adopt CARB rules. And that's what we're talking about today. And so why are they doing it? Why is Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, Washington, Oregon, and 5 other states that are adopting in 26 and 27? I don't know. For some reason, they want to push on environmental rules harder than the EPA standards, which you could debate that all day long, but if it's not attainable, then all it is costly, and it makes people lose out on business, and it makes people move states, and it makes people choose differently, and it hurts people in our states where they're just going to choose to do business elsewhere.
Okay. Now, as I understand it, since the initial rule was put in place by California, they've made several amendments, and Oregon appears to have adopted those amendments. Can you give us just an example or two of what these additions are?
They're really small amendments. There's 2. When I mentioned the omnibus/NOx earlier, Oregon did delay that 1 year. They said they weren't ready for it. And I would say also that for the same reasons we aren't ready for NOx, the omnibus rule, we're also not ready for the clean trucks for exactly the same reasons. But when you say they adopted some amendments, they did, but they're very small. Like, for example, instead of a 1 year ability for manufacturers to make up for the 7 or 11% EVs, they're allowing 3 years. So that's just one example of a small amendment that they're doing, which I would push back on that and say, what a huge risk for dealerships and manufacturers to take. If it's not attainable this year, then why would we think that in 2 or 3 years that all of a sudden we're not only going to make up for the 7% in 2025, but we're also going to make up for the 10% in 2026 and the 15% in 2027, because it continues on an upwards trend. The 7% of EV sales that need to happen in 2025 is just 2025. It steadily goes up until 40% in 2032. 40% of new truck sales in 2032 have to be EV according to these CARB rules that those 5 states and more have adopted.
And there's a real problem just being able to buy these electric trucks, much less the other concerns that many truckers have with them. I mean, there's not a great deal of availability, is there?
No, there's not. And if I were able to just talk about the tractor sales, Class 8 tractor sales in Oregon, I have those numbers. In sales in 2023, they sold a little over 1,700 Class 8 tractors. And of those, 9 of them were EVs. 9. And so you have to get to, just to match sales last year in 2023, you would have to sell 120 EVs just to make that 7% standard in that first year. So when I say it's not attainable, the infrastructure is not there. And we all know this. The infrastructure is not there. They're too expensive. They don't work. They don't haul the capacity that we can haul in Oregon. Our max capacity is 105.5, and so they're not rated for that. So just the application of these over-the-road trucks don't work. And this is actually almost funny, but it's true. In Oregon, we only have 1 commercial supercharger that can charge these trucks in a commercial basis. It's located in Portland. 1. And its uptime is 50% because of all of the stealing of the copper wires internally. So to say we're not ready and don't have the infrastructure is really an understatement.
I want to take a step back here for a moment, because you do have a direct connection with the trucking industry and experience in that industry. And I think that plays a lot into your passion for the issue and your knowledge about it. Can you just talk briefly a little bit about your connection to trucking?
Yeah. Thanks, Mark. Very proud of that. And when we say why I'm passionate about this, it's one of the reasons why I went into politics when I was asked to run for office in 2018. And I grew up in, basically, I grew up in a truck shop. I say all the time, my dad started Boss Art Trucking with 2 trucks and a dream back in 1983. And he and the family and incredible team members and employees grew that business to 35 trucks, which myself and a business partner purchased about 6 years ago. So we run 35 trucks now here in the Pacific Northwest, mostly Oregon, Washington, and mostly agricultural products, a lot of drayage. But like I said, mostly ag products. And so I come into the legislature and sit on the transportation committee with the knowledge of how trucks work, how logistics work, what the supply chain does, and how hard it is to get it up and running again when one of those links gets broken, which we saw during COVID, which we see in different applications. But I really speak transportation because I've lived it my entire life. And I know the incredible work that truck drivers and how professional they are. And they just want to do their job. They want to support their family. And for some reason, Oregon makes it so dang hard for people to just want to do those things. And so that's the passion behind it. But it's also, transportation is very complicated. And so when I bring this up, I'll talk to a fellow legislator and they'll say, no, I'm pretty sure that Oregon delayed that. And I'll say, no, that was NOx. They delayed NOx in October, not clean truck. And they're like, well, what's the difference? And so it's and that's just one little piece to it. Transportation is very complicated. And so it's a tough conversation to have within the legislature when you don't have that kind of background.
Drawing on that background, and I know you've made some of the points that are pertinent to this, but what do you see the practical effect on the trucking industry would be, assuming that this thing actually does go into effect as it's written now?
We know kind of, bigger companies buy lots of new trucks, right? And then a few years later, they sell those. Smaller companies buy up those trucks. And there's just kind of this natural attrition to doing so. I think that if this goes into effect, the irony of this is that companies will hold on to older trucks longer because they can't buy new trucks, right? So we know that dealerships here in Oregon do not have 2025 new trucks on the lot. They just don't have them. So companies are looking at, well, what do? Do you purchase out of state and bring them in? That's debatable on whether we can do that, whether the manufacturers will get fined, whether dealerships out of state will get fined for that and bring them back in. Or do you hold on to used vehicles longer, which I think will affect the market across all sizes of companies. And like I said, the irony is that you're holding on to older diesel machines longer instead of being able to buy the cleanest diesel, most efficient trucks out there, which I think is the irony of this. And that's just talking about the semi trucks, the heavy duty over the road. It also affects our dealerships. What do they do? Are they able to hold on long enough until we figure this out, whatever that question is? I think that's a big deal. Why would we put our dealerships into this problem where that affects our local community, affects jobs, it affects the relationship with our truckers in this industry? And then also, I believe truly that we're dealing with old data, not recognizing new trucks on the road. And we know if we compare the new truck compared to like a 1985 engine, they're not the same truck, right? The trucking industry has come a long way in reducing emissions, reducing NOx, reducing particulates, and it's not recognized. And I think truly that that's not fair, and that's how it's going to affect the industry in the future. And not just like we're talking about logical, realistic things. I don't think that the trucking industry gets the credit that they deserve, both in manufacturing and how far they've come with reducing emissions, but also the general public. And I'm just speaking from Oregon. I don't know if this is like this in other states. We certainly don't have the respect that they deserve. And they're looked down upon both inside the legislature and on our roads. And I think that's extremely unfair.
I've been talking with Oregon State Representative Shelley Bosshart Davis. We'll have more of that conversation after a short commercial break.
Are you tired of the IRS following you around like a dark cloud? Call 888-557-4020 and get your life back.
At Truck Stop, we've built a better load board for carriers like you. Sign up today and access over 600,000 loads on the most trusted online load board. Learn why the best in the business rely on Truck Stop to make more money and start driving your profit today.
Since you started, what you've loved about trucking is the freedom. Heading out on your favorite route, a good driving song, and thinking about truck insurance. Well, maybe not that last one. That's why we're here. At OOIDA, we have a full range of truck insurance products, expert advice, and great customer service, helping you get the right coverage for your operation. Go to OOIDA.com because your job is to drive. Our job is to help with everything else.
Landline Now, welcome back. Before the break, I was talking with State Representative Shelley Bosshart Davis of Oregon about her effort to either stop or delay the implementation of CARB regulations for large trucks in her state. We now continue that conversation in progress. The Oregon Environmental Quality Commission was scheduled to meet on November 21st, and as I believe that they actually did conduct that meeting, and it was regarding this exact topic. Can you tell us what happened there? Did they make any significant decision regarding the advanced clean truck rule or anything else related to it?
Well, I was there. So I actually showed up in person, and I will say that I was pleasantly surprised with how many people showed up from the industry, both in like OBI was there, which is our business and industry kind of coalition. Charla was there. She spoke on behalf of kind of business in Oregon, but there was also tow truck companies there explaining we have companies in both California and in Oregon. And let me tell you what happened in California and how we lost business. Please don't let that happen here. We had people from the RV world that spoke about how it's unattainable and how it caught them off guard. I mean, there's articles written, and I jokingly say, is it the RVs that are going to save us? Because they're the ones that are raising their hands saying, we can't do this. Nobody's buying an EV, an RV EV, right? And they just assumed, they knew that it was coming, but they just assumed they would be exempted. And so we heard a lot of people talk about how this is not attainable. Please delay it until we have more infrastructure, until we have more opportunity. They compared California to having a lot of funds available, resources available, and still they lost business. And here in Oregon, we don't have that kind of resources or money towards trying to improve the grid, improve the infrastructure. And so at that meeting, I was, like I said, I was pleasantly surprised how many people were there to speak against adopting these. You also had many pro keeping this in check, and that would be a lot of environmental groups that don't want to delay anything. They talk about diesel in Portland. They talk about not delaying this at all so that they would keep everything there. But at the end of the day, there was a lot of debate among commissioners, and they adopted the rules. So I still think that there's opportunity. I still think that we need to follow like what's happening, what's coming into Oregon. I don't think this is the end, but that's what happened on that in that actual meeting.
One of the things that, as I understand it, that they also did here is in trying to ease the transition here, they proposed what they called a suite of compliance flexibilities regarding the advanced clean truck regulations. What sort of flexibilities did they propose?
You know, we talked earlier a little bit about increasing from 1 to 3 years. They also talking about purchasing credits. So one thing that they say is the flexibility part of things where you can increase your sales by purchasing credits. So for example, Ford trucks. So we'll just talk about the Ford brand. You talk about just theirs. And so they sell F-250s, they sell F-350s, but they also sell Ford e-Transit vehicles. So that's going to be like your like Amazon type delivery truck, where they can sell an EV version of it, where they stop in the same location. So that application might work with an EV vehicle, right? I've also heard anecdotally that they don't like them, that they're kind of forced to buy them, they're forced to use them. Regardless, they do sell those. So they can sell a lot of those EV transits and then use those credits for being able to sell their F-250s, F-350s, right? So among the class 2B through 8 rigid trucks, not your tractor trucks, but your rigid trucks, you can transfer credits. And so that's one of those flexibility parts that they say will be able to help people comply. But that doesn't work everywhere. Like we talked about RVs, tow trucks, they're not selling other options where they can then just transfer credits. So they're going to have to go out onto the market and quote unquote buy credits somewhere. How do you do that? How much does that cost? How does that affect the end price into Oregon or any of these other states? I don't know the answer, but I'm going to suggest that it's not cheap. So that's one of those quote unquote flexibilities that they adopted so that they're like, no, you can absolutely do this. You can shift those sales between vehicle classes and everything will be fine. But those class 8 tractor trucks are in their own bucket where they can't transfer those credits. So they're stuck. They can't transfer any sort of credits. We know that people aren't buying EV class 8 tractors. And so that's one of the major problems in this rule.
You had written a letter regarding this entire situation that's gotten a lot of press coverage. I'm wondering if you can just tell us very quickly who you wrote the letter to and what basically the letter was about.
Yeah, thanks. I wrote from my office, for my state representative office, and I sent it to Chair Donegan and the members of the Oregon Environmental Quality Commission. And I basically lined out what it is, explained what it is. And then I talked about affordability, feasibility, demand, explained in California how in the heavy duty truck market in California, that market dropped 70% as they tried to figure out exactly how to do this. And again, we talk about how California had these huge efforts to fund grants, encourage investments, and they still had a 70% decrease. And we know that that didn't happen across North America. It wasn't like there was just a huge decrease in truck sales. It did happen in California. So then you think, well, what are they doing? What's California doing? Are they just holding on to trucks longer? Are they buying them from out of state? And from what I've heard, there's no real way to track that. In fact, one of the tow truck companies that I've been talking to, they say there's no real metric on tracking how many are being sold. So they don't even know if this is working, not working, because they're not tracking the information. So back to the letter, I asked, literally, I said, these states have delayed it. These states, there's even 3 states, let's see, Massachusetts, there's Massachusetts, North Carolina, and one other state that they originally adopted it a few years ago. They realized it's not feasible and they pushed it off indefinitely and just said, never mind, we're just going to follow EPA. We're not ready. It's not feasible. And then, like I said, 5 other states delayed it to 26 and 27. We're only one of a handful that are starting in literally less than 30 days. This is going to go into effect here in Oregon. And so I asked for a 1-year delay. Let's at least hold on to this. I would prefer that it go away. We just need to adopt EPA, but at least let's delay it so that we can give a chance to talk with the manufacturers and see what we can do. And I can tell you right now, people do not want EV over the road trucks. I mean, it doesn't happen. We know that it doesn't happen. I talked to a manufacturer just, 2 weeks ago, and he told me a specific example of a company that said, let me test out your EV. Let me test it out. I don't want to talk manufacturers or anything specific, which dealership, but this particular trucking company, this one route, and it was less than 80,000 GVW, so it wasn't a weight problem. They typically, this particular route typically made 2.5 round trips a day. So every other, couple days he's away. That was the particular route. With the same haul he made with an EV truck, he couldn't even make it 1 round trip. 1 round trip. Couldn't even make it 1 round trip. So when we talk about the application for over-the-road trucks, it just doesn't work.
Okay. Thank you very much for your time and for all the information. We sure appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark.
That was State Representative Shelley Bosshart Davis of Oregon talking about her effort to either stop or delay the implementation of the state's Advanced Clean Trucks Rule, which is based on CARB regulations. You can keep track of developments in Oregon by going to the website landline.media. Under the news menu, click on News by State. That's our program for today. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back tomorrow with more. I'm Mark Reddick, and this is Landline Now.
Thanks for listening. Be sure to like and subscribe. If you want more content, go to landline.media to get updated news, information, and archived editions of our show. Once again, that's landline.media.
I'm a dad,
a son,
a husband,
wife.
I'm a writer,
photographer.
I farm.
I'm a veteran.
I love old cars, fishing,
my kids,
Chrome.
And I am
a professional truck driver.
And together we are OOIDA.
OOIDA was founded by truckers to stand up and speak on behalf of truckers. We've done that by combining the individual voices of our members into a single, powerful voice. Protecting your interests, defending your rights.
Join us! Make your voice heard. Join OOIDA, the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. Call 1-800-444-5791 or visit OOIDA.com.